welcome Professor Hanson. Before we start, I'll just give some technical introduction, and then I'll introduce Professor Hanson. So today we're using Zoom, and it's on mute because the technology isn't quite there yet where we can all talk. So everybody should feel free to chatter away on the right-hand side, or you may have a button at the bottom of your screen that says chat, and ask questions there as well. So the Professor Hanson can take them towards the end. In addition to the people who are watching here on Zoom, some people are watching on Facebook. And I should also say that people are pouring in all the time. People do tend to show up when it starts, not before it starts. So people are arriving all the time. Our schedule is that Professor Hanson will give a talk, and then we'll have questions and answers. After that, it's time for mingling. And we'll use Zoom breakout rooms this time. In the past, we used some sort of virtual reality spaces, which are cool, but there were technology problems. So we're going to try the more square way to do it. But we also have Mozilla hubs available if for some reason Zoom breakout rooms cannot handle it, or if people just want to do that. The whole point of these breakout rooms and the hubs is that people spread out into small groups to chat after the main event, which is why we have more than the one space to have the discussion. Okay, if anyone has any questions, you can also directly message me at any time. And the breakout rooms, unfortunately, are designed for teachers to send their students off to talk to each other. And therefore, you cannot change your breakout room. So you can ask me using the chat or using email, and I'll do my best, as of course I'm doing a lot of things at the same time. Okay, so I'm gonna take a couple of breaths as more people arrive. A lot of people. So now I'd like to introduce Professor Robin Hanson. He's a professor of economics at George Mason University, but he's best known to us in the rationalist sphere, SlateStarCodex, Less Wrong, transhumanism. He's best known as the innovator of very creative ideas, very different ideas that are outside of the normal discourse, but when he explains them, they make a lot of sense. And prediction markets is one of them. So there was a vote, and that was the topic that people wanted to hear about. So now I'd like to hand it over to you, Professor Hanson.
Welcome all. Thanks for having me here. I look forward to talking. I hope somebody will show me how to join a breakout room afterwards, because I don't see anything like that here on my screen, but somebody will show me something, hopefully. So this is a topic I've talked on many times over many years, but not so much lately, but it's a favorite. And many of you have probably already heard a fair bit about it, but we're just going to go through the basics first, and then I'm eager to discuss things with you. So starting from the very beginning, the key point is, for most of the issues we have in our world, most of the things that we argue about and discuss and agonize over, the key issue is, can we get information to have accurate beliefs about these topics? That is the key question on all the things you ever discuss or argue or agonize about. If only you had more accurate information about them, including perhaps about your preferences, then you could make better decisions. We could make better decisions. So in some sense, the grand question is, how can we decide what to believe? And the real difficult question in epistemology, i.e. what to believe, is social epistemology. How do we all come together to share our institutions, to share some institutions, so that we can specialize in different topics and then together decide what to believe? And so I've been thinking about that for a long time, but if you go in the world, you'll see that many people say they have solutions to that. They will just solve it for you. That is, people say, I know it's difficult to decide what to believe, but just believe me. And I will tell you what to believe about everything else. And we have many institutions in some sense of this form, science, journalism, regulatory divisions, professional licensing, all these sorts of organizations. And they basically say, yes, we know it's hard to know who to believe. We will just tell you who you can believe and tell you what to believe. And of course, as you know, you can't necessarily trust all these people who tell you that you can trust them. And I was a physics student long ago, so I'm very aware that when in physics and in computer science, most of the world does believe what we say, because they don't really care. But when I moved to economics, I learned that the world is very skeptical. Economists say pretty straightforward, standard things, and the world goes, that can't possibly be right. And so I'm very well aware that it's not enough just to have some experts who go figure something out. The question is, how can you communicate to a wide audience in a way that they could actually credibly believe you if they have reason to be skeptical, which they should. That is, most of these methods that these various groups have, the scientific method, the journalism method, the statistical method, et cetera, they've got a lot of holes in it. If you're willing to at all be skeptical, there's lots of room to be skeptical. There's lots of reasons not to be sure that they're all telling you the truth. So I'm interested in developing institutions and mechanisms such that we can actually create a division of intellectual labor and trust each other and believe each other. And I've worked in some other areas where I think, say, we can learn to trust doctors or lawyers or other specialists through what I call paying for results, even in criminal law, paying for results. I've got some other things to talk about there that I'm happy to talk about some other time if you want to have me back. But here, this is this most meta question of how to decide what to believe about claims. And the way to frame the question before I give you what I think the answer is to say you want an institution where you can buy information or buy reliable beliefs. So there'll still be a question of who pays for it. And if nobody pays for it, maybe it won't happen. But if somebody's willing to pay for reliable information, is there a way that they can put money on the table? And then the people who are actually able to generate reliable information can supply it. And then they can get paid for that information in a way that we can all believe that, yeah, that must have been the reliable information that they got paid for. And somebody else can't just come in and claim to know something and get paid without actually knowing something. That's what we're looking for. We, of course, won't use this mechanism when we have easy other approaches. If you want to know what I had for breakfast, just ask me. I'm probably not going to lie. It's for bigger, important topics where there's more at stake, where more people might be tempted to mislead us. The question is, what can we do there? And here is an extremely important point. I want a mechanism, not just that it does produce reliable information according to an expert who really studied it carefully and in their own personal view decided it is producing reliable information. I want an institution that an ordinary person can look at, have explained to them, and then come to reasonably believe that it is producing reliable information on the basis of what they just heard explained to them. That's a much higher bar, of course. We want to know, be able to tell an ordinary person, you can believe this. This is an acceptable source that you should defer to. Now, in some sense, most institutions basically say, well, you can believe us because the prestigious people in the world believe us too, or they defer to us at least. They won't contradict us. And in some sense, that's the most robust standard institution for anything is, oh, the prestigious people say so, so we'll support it. But I want to do a lot better than that. So I want an institution where you can buy the information. So now a generic solution, which my proposal is an instance of, would be to say, well, there's an institution that produces some sort of consensus as an output based on, of course, whatever topics people choose to pay for, because somebody will have to be paying for them. Anybody can join this institution if they want to participate. And if they ever see that the current output of that institution is wrong in some way, in some consistent way, if they can ever see a bias or error in the output of that institution, there's a place they can go where they stand and they say, I fixed that. And it takes some resources and effort, but if they go and fix it, they will get paid more than compensating their effort in order to pay them for actually fixing it. So generic institution, whenever there's an error, somebody sees an error, they can get paid for fixing it. So the more specific version of that I have in mind is that is betting markets, basically. Now, this won't work for everything. It's going to work for things where after the fact, we can see who was right. And there are other topics you might want. But in fact, most of the important decisions we need to make in the world are actionable decision, information about if we do something, what are the consequences? And so I think if you can just create an institution that tells people pretty broadly and reliably, if you do something, what are the consequences that you will see later, that you will notice, that gets you a long way toward fixing most of the problems with who can you believe about important things. So the key idea then is betting markets or speculative markets. So for many centuries, we have had speculative markets, i.e. places where there's a price on something and you can either go speculate that the price will rise or speculate that the price will fall. And if you happen to know on average which way the price is going to go, then you make money on that. So you can turn any market where the prices fluctuate into a money pump just by knowing which way the prices might go. And so people have been attracted to those, and they've turned speculative markets into information machines in the sense that it tends to be hard to predict future prices beyond the current price. The current price is a good best estimate of future prices. And if you can ever figure out a better estimate, you can make money on that by trading on it and fixing the price in the market. So that's this instance of this generic competitive institution where if anybody sees a mistake, they can come fix it. And where it's relatively easy to explain to people why this is a trustworthy institution, why you should believe it, because of this feature that if anybody can find a mistake, they can fix it and make money. All right, so that's the institution that I'm interested in. And we've had many demonstrations over decades where we've had a speculative market, a betting market on a topic, and we've had some other institution on the same sort of topic at the same time with any remotely similar sort of participants. And consistently what we've seen in those comparisons is that the betting market either does substantially better or about the same as whatever else you were doing in terms of the usual things people do. So, and that's the major data point that makes you think this would be a good idea to apply more widely. We do have theoretical reasons to understand why that might happen, but my argument mainly isn't based on those theoretical reasons. It's based more on the idea that, look, they seem to work. So, let's see how to see myself here. Anyway, so the key idea is these betting markets, we can make them on purpose, even though in the past, most betting markets weren't made for this purpose. They were just a side effect of other things. But if we make a market on purpose on a question we want, then we can pay to set up that market and even pay to subsidize it. And then we can get people trading with us in the market and then use those prices as information. Now, there are many ways to sort of set up the mechanics of markets and details, and they can matter for like how many markets you can support, but they don't tend to matter that much for the prices. And so the focus really is on just having the markets and on topics that matter. And they turns out, if you want to ask me about it, they are quite robust to manipulation in the sense of people trying to manipulate them much more than most other institutions. And that's a good feature of them. Now, in the space of things like this, pretty much any variation is better than status quo. So I'm happy to support lots of things that are kind of like what I suggested when they produce anything like a track record that gets scored and rated, because most of the benefit comes from just tracking what people say, rating it against the truth, and creating incentives for them to not want to look bad when they are scored later on against the truth. And so there are various sorts of what I call curated tournaments out there, where they collect participants and they decide which people talk on which topics and maybe join which teams. And then they create some consensus of all the things they say. And then they have a scoring rule to reward each person or score them on how good they were. And again, these mechanisms are substantially better than not having anything, certainly, which is the typical case in most of the world, or having just people say things and supposed to believe them. But I do worry that they have this center you have to trust. And so the betting markets, in my view, don't so much have a center you have to trust. So you don't have to trust them to decide who does on what or who scored how or how the consensus is produced. Therefore, it's more robust to these problems where, like we economists, people just don't trust a center and they don't believe the center is acting in their interest. And therefore, we can have consensus on these controversial topics where if there were a center you had to trust, you wouldn't trust it. Now, in general, betting markets are good for creating consensus, but as I said, what you most want for most decisions is decision contingent estimates. You want to know if you do something, what are the consequences? And we can create betting markets for those. There have been fewer of those made. There have been some, and I want people to focus on those because I think those have bigger potential. So one version of that is we have, say, presidential election markets, and we have betting markets in which people will be nominated by their party, and we have betting markets in who will eventually become, say, US president. Those are two different numbers. And if you take the ratio of those numbers, that's the probability that a candidate will become president if they are nominated. And literally that's advice to the party on who to nominate. It says, if you want to nominate someone who will win, pick the ones who have the highest probability of winning given nomination. That's what I call a decision market, or even Futarchy sometimes, the giving advice to decisions that matters. Now, another example that I'd like you to think about to motivate you for how far this can go is what I call fire the CEO markets. In an ordinary stock market, you trade cash for stock. So when you bet in those markets, when you trade in those markets, you ask yourself, this company, what is it worth in all the different scenarios I can imagine? In each scenario, you say it's worth this much, and then you weight all those scenarios together and get a weighted average for the overall value of the company as the price you'd be willing to pay for it. And if you see the price is too high, you sell. If the price is too low, you buy. in the markets I want to create, for each company in the Fortune 500, we'd have one market that trades the stock for cash, but where the trades are called off if the CEO does not stay until the end of this quarter. And in the other market, we'd have a market where we trade stock for cash, but those trades would be called off if the CEO was in power at the end of the quarter. And these two markets would then, when people traded on them, they'd be averaging over the scenarios consistent with that condition, i.e. the condition that CEO stays and CEO doesn't, and they'd produce conditional estimates of the value of the company, or averaging over all the scenarios consistent with the condition. How much is this company worth given that the CEO stays or given the CEO leaves? And the difference between those two prices can be taken as advice about whether the board of directors or whoever's in charge should keep the CEO or not. And as an advisory thing, it could be useful in the background, but it can be even more useful as a direct mechanism if you put it into the constitution of the company, saying we will just change CEOs whenever the market says the company is worth more with the new CEO. That's an example of a decision market. It's an example of one that would be very valuable. That is, I think if you gave me $1 million in 5 years, I could do an experiment with all the Fortune 500 and get enough data to show that the set of companies that follow the advice does better than the set of companies that don't. And with that data, then convince board of directors or courts when I sue them that they should be following this advice, and then change corporate accountability in 5 years and $1 million. I've had that proposal out for a while and nobody's given me the $1 million yet or anybody else to do it, but I still think it would have a big potential. But this shows you the idea, which is that we can do governance better by having an outcome measure that we agree on. And so for most public companies, the stock price is a pretty agreed on outcome measure. And then a discrete decision, in this case, do we keep the CEO or not? And then we have markets estimating the outcome conditional in the discrete decision, and we compare the outcomes to decide which is better. Now, this idea has enormous potential. I'd say what it mainly needs and has needed for a while is just lots of small scale trials. You can apply this idea to a group of people having pizza every week, to churches. There's just all sorts of places this idea could be applied, but it hasn't been yet. And the major obstacle is that it's politically disruptive. Most organizations pretend that they want to aggregate information and analyze information. It's just a classic thing everybody agrees is a good idea, but mostly people are doing politics. And these markets are basically interfere with politics. They're like somebody in the C-suite who's an autist who just has no idea what's politically correct and just tells everybody what it thinks. That person won't last in the C-suite in most organizations, even if they're useful as an advisor. So what we need are these small scale tests, and I'm happy to work with any organization that wants to do it. But in order to try to inspire more tests like this, what I sometimes do and will do now is to paint a picture of how far this could go. And in order to paint that grandiose picture, I'm going to go to, say, the national level. You could go even farther to an international. I'd say, imagine running a nation with the same sort of mechanism. And that's what I've given the name Futarchy more directly to. And that's what I want to elaborate for a moment. So the key idea here is I'm going to solve one main problem of governance, which is aggregating information about the consequences of our actions. Now, that's not the only problem in governance. And so what I'm going to try to do is leave the other solutions to the other problems alone and just change this one solution as far as I can. And that produces my slogan, vote on values, but bet on beliefs. Today we vote on things, fine. Keep voting on the values part, because I'm not going to change how we decide what we want. I'm going to try to change how we decide how to get what we want. So now the key idea is we still have a legislature, we still have a set of status quo policies, and the legislature now, instead of passing bills that change the policies, they only pass bills that change our measure of national welfare. And that's going to be something measured like the Bureau of Labor Statistics, where they put GDP and leisure and the environment and international prestige all together in some formula. And they constantly go out and measure things, and then they produce a number every month or quarter saying how well we're doing according to this measure. And what we're going to do is have betting markets predict that national welfare, conditional on policies. So the key idea is we're going to have an agenda mechanism whereby new bills get proposed, put on the agenda. Everybody focuses on that for a moment. Then we have a betting market on what national welfare will be if that bill is passed. And if it's not passed, we're looking at the difference of those two. And if the market says by that difference that we expect to be better off if this bill is passed, then we just pass the bill. That's the Constitution, unless there's some constitutional violation or something in the bill. And that's the key idea of Futarchy. And it's intended to show you just how far we could go with this. And I have some other details about making it work better, like having a veto if the same sort of markets with future defined welfare disagree, because, hey, you might change the welfare definition to account for a problem here. But that's the key idea. I know when I've given these talks before, most everybody just has a few concerns that pop immediately to their mind. And we'll have a limited time to go through those, but I'm happy to go through as many as we can. But I'll point out some of the obvious things you might already be thinking about. Obviously, sabotage is one issue. Is there a way someone could mess up the welfare measure in order to win a bet? And then that's going to be very hard to do with national welfare. In a smaller organization, it's more feasible. And then the general principle should be to make sure everybody has a positive stake in whatever thing might happen. Like if there's a project that might not make a deadline, you make sure everybody wins something if they make the deadline, but then they can bet how much they win in order to reveal their information. Another problem is if you make these markets advisory only, then you can have what's called a decision selection bias, where the people betting wonder, what the decision will be, and the information that would predict that predicts other things, and that creates a bias in their estimates. In principle, it would be better to randomly to do these betting markets based on, let's say, a 1% chance of making the decision randomly, but that's kind of hard to do. I don't think it's much of a problem. Actually, what I think is the biggest problem with the system is that it makes hypocrisy less feasible. Everybody says they don't like hypocrisy, but they lie, as you might expect. And so with many of our existing government institutions, our politicians can pretend they care a lot about trees, they care a lot about criminal rights, say, but the citizens don't really care that much. And they can get the politicians to do stuff that actually give the citizens what they want, but they can pretend otherwise through the words that were given. So under Futarchy, or this system, we have to be more honest about what we want. So if we raise the weight on trees because we say we like trees a lot, well, you know what, we're going to get a lot more trees at the expense of lots of other things, and that's how it'll happen, and people probably don't like that. That's also true with some of the other ways I talk about paying for results. One of the disadvantages is then you get the results that you said you wanted to pay for, even if you were lying. And people do lie about these things a lot. But there are many other concerns you could raise, and I'm happy to let you bring them up. But standing back here at the highest level, I'd say, the basic situation here is that the fundamental problem we all face in society is we have all these important issues to decide personally and collectively in our small groups and even in our nations and our world. For each of these topics, we are uncertain, and different people tell us they have different expertise and opinions. And the fundamental problem is, how do we decide who to believe on what? And our institutions for doing that are defective in the sense that, well, we just go with our intuitions based on who we hear, or we've got some journalism institution or some academic institution. And those, if you look at how they work, they aren't very inspiring as a way to produce reliable estimates. Here is this mechanism we've been using for a long time. It looks like it would give us reliable estimates on a great many important topics, and therefore solve this fundamental problem we've been dealing with for a long time, how to decide what's true together. We've done lots of lab demonstrations, and we've done more field demonstrations, and it seems like it works. We just need to keep building it up and making it work on larger scales. So this biggest problem we all have has a solution that hasn't been tried much, and it seems promising in all its related variations and in the trials so far. And yet, what I find myself unable to do is get anybody to care. If only I could get some smaller scale trials where people would try these mechanisms out, then we could test them and slowly move them to larger scales, as they seem to have good track records on smaller scales, and then eventually reform not only how we fire CEOs, but how we decide most important things in government and in the world. We could, of course, decide how to deal with existential risk or global warming, et cetera, all if we had institutions that let us all share and decide, okay, I believe this institution tells us what's going on. But the key problem is people don't care. That is, I think people's interaction with politics isn't really of the form they're trying to make it work. It's of the form, I want to, rah-rah my side, my tribe fights your tribe, etc. That's the thing that motivates people, animates people, makes them emotionally passionate about politics. And this doesn't give them that. It doesn't let them beat the other side's head with something. Whereas the other things people talk about in politics offer that more. But again, I think this still has enormous potential, and I know you have some concerns and issues that you are about to bring up, and I am eager to hear them now. That's a cue to someone to tell us these questions, unless I'm supposed to be finding them.
So, how might one market this to low decouplers, like people who maybe have been taught that markets are bad?
So this isn't all markets. That is, some people would paint this as the argument, well, markets are good, this is a market, therefore this is good. That's a pretty bad argument. You want to say, look, this is a very particular kind of market. It's a particular kind of market with a particular history and a particular data set and a particular scope. And so I'd say this particular market is good. And then if you bring up typical objections to markets, then I would apply those objections in this context. For example, you might say, well, look, in markets, rich people have more influence. That would be an objection you might bring up. And this is a market, therefore in this market, rich people have more influence. And I'd say, well, yeah, in the short term, but if you just spend your influence as a rich person here arbitrarily without actually knowing more, you will lose your wealth quickly here. And other people who actually know more will gain your wealth. So this isn't just a voting system where the people with more wealth get more votes. This is a competitive environment where if you can't be the best, you will lose. And most people will only manage to stay and exist for any extended period if they are the best. Then I'm sure you can bring up other objections, but that would be the general form of saying, well, tell me the objection, the particular kind of objection you have to markets in general, and then we can try to ask, does that objection apply here, or in what way?
There's a question from Ariel Krakowski. How do I ensure that the market can't be gamed? It seems that people with enough money can overwhelmingly bet for one decision.
So that was the issue of manipulation that I alluded to before. So let's, but now the word game just means does something suspicious, which isn't very specific. So let me invoke a particular kind of gaming. And then if you have other kind of gaming concerns, I encourage you to bring them up. But the particular kind of gaming concern most expressed is the idea that somebody might trade in the market and be willing to lose on their trades in order to gain in the decisions they want. So say the CEO markets. The CEO doesn't want to be fired. So say the CEO goes into the market and trades up the price of how much the company is worth if the CEO stays, and trades down the price of how much the CEO is worth if the company leaves. That would be the incentive of the CEO in the fire the CEO markets. But if other people suspect the CEO will do that, that will make them all the more eager to go on the opposite side that they expect the CEO to go on. And in fact, that's what we have seen in experimental and field markets and in theory. Quite consistently, when we add people to these markets who have some incentive to manipulate the price, other traders compensate by increasing the size and number of their trades and putting more effort to get information, which more than compensates by makes the market, in fact, more accurate. That is, on average, when you add manipulators to these markets, they get more accurate. The price is closer to the truth.
Okay, so we have a question. Do you think crypto will enable prediction markets to become mainstream? There are 5 crypto prediction markets right now, including Augur, which is backed by the founder of Ethereum.
So the actual obstacle, in my opinion, to the interesting thing, the most interesting thing, is not law. It's not legal barriers. So real organizations, what I want them to do is to apply these prediction markets inside their organizations to answer key organizational decisions, like firing the CEO. When you have the participants in these organizations playing in the markets, that is not illegal. As long as you pay their stakes, then it's not gambling because they never put any money in. So the crypto markets are not actually making these things legal because they're already legal. The obstacle isn't legality. The obstacle is the political disruption that these things perform in organizations. Organizations have tried them and quickly learn, oh, this is a political hot potato. It disturbs our political equilibrium. We don't like it. That's the obstacle. Now, crypto markets might make it more possible to do sort of general betting in the wider public, but that's not actually where I see the main gains. I see the gains from people who actually want to buy information and have people they know who might be able to give it in some sort of organization. That's where I see the biggest gains, and the legal obstacles aren't the problem there, and so crypto doesn't. And of course, as you may know, crypto companies all like pretended initially that they were going to disrupt and ignore all the laws, but then very quickly they all had a post office box and met at real meetings, and they all declared, oh, we're going to follow all the laws anyway. So it's not actually clear that the crypto people actually can evade laws any more than non-crypto.
Clark Urzo asks, how do we solve perverse incentives in prediction markets? As in the CEO example, who has an incentive to threaten people not to bet against him?
So I already talked about the manipulation by the CEO. A different issue would be retaliation. And that's, of course, a reason why we want people to be able to trade anonymously. So one of the most successful examples of these markets in most organizations are deadline markets. Say you have a project with a deadline, and you ask people related to the project, will we make the deadline? And typically when you ask them through a meeting or some sort of project report, they nod and say, yes, we'll make the deadline, because whoever's in charge of the project stares them down and says, you better say that. But if you allow them to bet anonymously about whether they'll make the deadline, they quite consistently give you much more honest advice, which is often much more pessimistic about whether you make the deadline. That's been a consistent track record we've seen in organizations. I can tell you why that's a problem, because they don't like that, but that's enabled because you allow people to bet anonymously. If they required them to bet publicly with their name, then of course, whoever would retaliate in the meeting for them saying otherwise also would retaliate against them betting in the market. But anonymity in the markets is a sufficient solution to that.
Daniel Kang asked on Facebook, it seems that a lot of people don't want the best to win. For example, some people want equity in outcomes. Do you have thoughts on how to convince people this is a good idea? It seems that prediction markets might boost unpopular policies that may improve welfare measurements, and people may not like this. Do you have any thoughts on this?
So I'm not sure I fully understood the question, so feel free to ask again if I don't address it well here. But I see two equity issues. One equity issue is in, say, the outcomes we're looking for, and then you can include inequity in the outcomes you're considering. So the national welfare measure can completely consider inequity in the welfare measure. It could, for example, average over the square root of wealth or something like that, instead of linear in wealth, which penalizes inequality. So there's no contradiction here in inequality in the outcomes in terms of the advice that we're giving. But then you might focus on inequality within the participants of the market. You might say, well, these betting markets are not very equal among their participants. That is, some of them will have much more influence than others. Some will win, some will lose. And that's just a generic feature of all the information institutions we've ever had, honestly. So today, when you have, say, a big government agency, which has employees and has various committees they look to, et cetera, that represents enormous inequality and information influence across society. Most people aren't a member of that agency. They aren't on the committees, et cetera. But that's sort of the idea of information specialization, that we don't want to all have equal influence on all topics. We want to each be able to specialize in different topics, and we want to create incentives and a prospect for that. So we have already mostly seemed to accept this idea of enormous information inequality in terms of who knows how much and who is seen as expert on how much on each topic, in trade for using that information to then produce whatever amount of inequality we want through the decisions we make. So the EPA might have very unequal experts in terms of who counts how much in recommending things to the EPA, but then the EPA's recommendations may take equity into account when deciding what to do in the world, and better advice can produce more equity in that outcome.
So Robin, hi. Question kind of following up on that. If we want to account for inequality, we need to specify exactly what we mean by inequality. And kind of similarly with all of these other goals. So we have this problem that we need to specify exactly what we want in ways that I don't know are fully feasible, whereas current organizations can rely on the people in charge to have biased but reasonable views about those things. So we can expect that people will appreciate what strikes them as unfair inequality in a way that we don't know we can pre-specify if we have to pick what the goal is exactly. Does that strike you as a plausible concern for using markets?
So the concern in errors in our outcome measure and our outcome measures is an issue. That is, the larger are the errors in your outcome measure, the larger will be the error in the policies you produce. I don't accept the claim that existing institutions do a very good job of that, in the sense that whoever is running things, they're also based on estimates with errors. And those often are biased in addition to being error prone. Here, we can not just explicitly measure things, but we can use just overall subjective measures. So for example, one of the things that can go into national welfare is at the end of the year, we can just ask people, how was your year? And then you can use that to summarize all of the other things we didn't include in our official measures. Similarly, you can ask outsiders, what do you think of this country or this place? Does it look like a prosperous place? And they can tell you subjectively based on all the subjective things that. So having official measures doesn't mean they have to itemize all the important things. They can be based on just asking people, what do you think about the important things? But the question is, who do we ask, how, and when? So putting somebody in charge of the EPA who's supposedly going to include all the things but has all these political pressures doesn't seem to be remarkably nearly as feasible as, hey, if you want to ask people how's the environment and you can't get it all in your official environment measures, just go ask people about the environment. Say, what do you think of the environment? You know, take surveys, score those, and use those in the measure.
So Parthaya asks on Facebook, can we track the outcomes from decisions that a Futarchy government would have made in comparison to a real elected government? What would we need to build in order to have this data side by side over years and to help either confirm or negate these concerns that are being brought up?
So in general, when you're trying to innovate a new institution or new mechanism or new anything, it does pay to try to create prototypes and then directly compare those prototypes to the status quo alternatives that you would be using instead. That's what you want to do in all sorts of areas of innovation. That's what you want to do in this area as well. So that means when we do these small scale trials I'm talking about, ideally you want to do these trials in comparison with some status quo variation. So if you're going to say, you know, have markets in the CEO firing, say, what if you picked a third of the companies and you didn't have a market for their CEOs? Well, now they would just be making their decisions some other way. And you can compare that third of the companies who don't get the market advice to the 2/3 who do. Those are things you want to do when you're testing. So as always, there's a big difference between what you want to do when you're testing something versus when you're just using it. When you're driving a car, you can drive it anywhere because you want to go there. But if you want to test a car, then you want to have the car on a standard track compared to some other cars that might go on that standard track or some other transport mechanism, and control the other variations so that you can do controlled tests to see how well it does. So yes, in the early days of testing and exploring this, you want to do controlled variations where you test it in the same context or you do something else, or at least when you do random it. I can tell you lots of ideas for simple trials and tests. And yes, in most of those, what I want to do is have controls where we also have some similar variations that don't have these markets to advise them so that we can compare the quality of their decisions to the quality of the ones with the market advice.
Do you envision the possibility of a market crash in the prediction market, and how would you interpret it?
Well, a crash is just another example of wrong prices. So prices are estimates and they can be in error. So every institution, of course, that would compete with these markets is also going to be producing estimates, and they can also be in error. So the question is, what does the distribution of errors look like, and is the distribution better? So for each mechanism we have different theories about the causes of the errors. And in markets, we have a certain kind of error you might call a crash. And so the key thing is to ask, well, what tends to cause that kind of error? And is there a way to make it better? Or is it all right to have that kind of error as part of the portfolio of error if the package of errors is less? So right from the beginning, I'd say, look, most markets can have crashes of the form you have in mind, but nevertheless, when we compare markets to other things, even including that problem, they still are on average better. And so you might, from the beginning, then say, well, look, this is a price worth paying. If they have these kind of errors, fine. They still could be better on average. Then in addition, we could ask, well, how could we reduce that kind of error? So I want to distinguish in general, this first comparing sort of a baseline version of this system compared to what we're doing now, and then comparing this baseline version to other versions we could figure out which might be better. Whatever we start with, we would of course want to keep working on it perhaps and try to make it better, but that shouldn't prevent us from trying to get a first version going if the first version will be better than what we're doing now. So in general, mostly people look back and they call things a market crash or a market bubble when they think the price was wrong. They say, well, you know, the price went up and down a lot then, but later on it went back again. So that must have been a crash or bubble. What does that mean? That just means it looks like it undid it thought something had changed and then it reversed its opinion later. But it's not obvious that's always wrong. Sometimes that may be wrong, but in some sense, that's just part of the general process of a system making estimates that it changes its mind on over time. Sometimes it's going to make a big change, mostly little changes. Sometimes when it makes a big change, it'll change its mind again or reverse back. We want the best incentives to do that well, even if sometimes you make mistakes like that.
When do betting markets seem to converge to the next best non-betting prediction, and when do they tend to diverge? Is it just down to information availability?
Well, the way I think about it is, if the situation is such that other institutions would just work fine, then they'd all give you the same answer. So you want to use this institution when you suspect the other institutions may not be fine. And that's sort of a generic, tool of application principle in general, right? If you've got a hammer and you got a nail the hammer works on, just use the hammer and be done with it. If you got a thing and your hammer doesn't seem to work or you're not sure it's working, well, then you might get something fancier that will replace the hammer. It'll be more expensive, but it might be more reliable and make sure the thing works. So a prediction market is a somewhat more expensive mechanism. It's got overhead, it's got mechanisms, it's got things you have to set up. And so that overhead isn't worth the bother if what you're doing is easy and there's no problem. So what's the application here? You ask people questions and you're not sure they're going to tell you the truth. You think they might lie. You think they might lie to themselves. You think they might lie to you. They think they might get groupthink. When you suspect that these people might not be fully honest with you and it's important enough, that's when you want a prediction market. If you want to know what I had for breakfast, you don't think I'd lie about that, just ask me what I had for breakfast. I'll tell you what I had for breakfast and we're done. You don't have to set up a prediction market on what I had for breakfast. The prediction market on breakfast might be, well, just as accurate as what I told you, but it'll be more expensive, so don't bother. But when you're thinking about big things like global warming or AI risk or something like that, where you do suspect that people aren't being fully honest, they're being blowhards, they're pretending they know more than they do, they're pushing various lines, that's when you might want to have some stronger incentives to get them to tell you the truth.
Jonathan is asking a question about prediction markets at work. He's in charge of a project. He doesn't pay salaries, but he has the opportunity to start a prediction market. How would you suggest that he start? Is there something you suggest that he would try?
So the largest failure mode in prediction markets and organizations is somebody says, I think this is a cool idea. I want to start one, but I don't have any budget or influence and I can't get any management backing, but I'm just going to throw something together and turn it on. In that scenario, the most common outcome is people shrug and go, why should I bother? You haven't given me any incentive to participate, and including I don't believe anybody else is going to participate and nobody will pay any attention to this, so what's the point? So fundamentally in an organization, the main cost of prediction markets is the people's time. Usually you can make the cost of the software pretty low. So it's the people's time and attention is the cost. Somebody has to pay for that time and attention. And ideally it would be because a market will be asking questions that are important enough to the organization that the organization will subsidize those markets, not just directly through money, but through attention and prestige and the prospect that will be listening to it enough that will induce people to participate. People will put their time in, which is valuable, and we will produce information which is even more valuable. That would be the positive prospect. If you just invite people to participate without offering any prospect of their personal reward or that the organization is going to be listening, the usual reasonable thing for everybody to do is say, thanks, no thanks, I'm busy. So I'd say, try to create an impression that this is something that somebody will be listening to. If you can't get anybody to say that they will be listening to this and willing to offer resources for it, you aren't ready yet to ask for people's time, because at least not on the basis of compensating them for their time, because that's the valuable, costly thing here that we want to make sure we pay attention to.
Mr. R is asking, what regulations do you think might crop up to restrict prediction markets? If prediction markets start growing and yet the government step in and regulate, what are the most harmful possible regulations?
So at the moment, as you may know, just gambling regulations do create obstacles when you can't just use organization members and pay for them. So obviously gambling regulations are a big obstacle now. But another regulation that is actually now an obstacle that people don't realize is insider trading regulations. So when you create a market, if the topic of the market is some inside topic, then people who bet in the market and see the market will get inside information from the market, which is a no-no. So as you may know, the myth of insider trading is that in every important organization, there are key inside topics and only top insiders know those things, and they only communicate them to the public through official announcements where they declare their inside information. And therefore, any other process by which information that those insiders have about inside questions gets to outside traders is illegal, illicit insider trading. And that regulation then makes it hard to create a market where insiders and non-insiders both bet on a topic that is relevant to in key question in the company. So I would also like to see, more. So for example, a simple solution would be say, make the prediction market, but make the prices public, let everybody see the prices, and now that's the way in which it's allowed the inside information gets out. If you just had the legal interpretation that publicly visible prediction markets in the organization counted as a valid way for the company to give its inside information to outsiders, then people trading those markets wouldn't therefore be accused of illegal insider trading because they saw the market prices or they participated.
Okay. Albert S. asks, how do you propose we choose which policies are worthy of consideration by prediction markets, given that there's a possibly a limited number of topics that can be considered? Would pro-social proponents of a particular policy contribute to subsidizing a market for it?
Well, obviously, at some sort of larger futarchy level, we could have proposals that were about how to pick topics. So, the futarchy concept is a whole form of governance. And so that would be a valid question to ask it. You could say, well, we're going to have these markets in the key governance bills, but what other markets should we subsidize? You could propose a bill under futarchy, which made a proposal about which things should be subsidized how, or which decision should be made. That bill might be passed, and then those subsidies would go through. And then, of course, if somebody came up with a better idea how to change the priorities of which things were subsidized, they could make a new bill that then proposed to overrule the old one. And if the speculators thought that was a better bill, then that would become the new policy by which we decided which markets to subsidize. So that would be the generic futarchy answer. Of course, without futarchy, if it's just having the markets, then it's, as I said, it's about the buyers. Whoever is willing to buy the information pays for it. And if nobody will buy it, it doesn't happen. That is the simple default answer when different people have different budgets for which they can pay for information. I do have a proposal how we could, inside, say, companies do what I call information accounting, whereby each organization declares that certain topics are valuable to it, it puts a certain color of money on those topics, and that's how it pays for those topics. And other people in the company, when they trade, they gain that color of money to credit their bottom line in the organization account. But that's a complication.
Kurt, maybe you already asked this, but what document is the best sort of introduction to, and maybe also what document is the best, the most comprehensive exploration of futarchy and prediction markets?
Well, prediction markets is this larger topic. Certainly for futarchy, there is my Journal of Political Philosophy article, which shall we vote on values but bet on beliefs. That's sort of this larger scale vision. Then I have a paper in, I can give the link after this, I guess, on decision markets and sort of their considerations and whether you want to make decisions markets or not for policy choices. And then, of course, there's a lot of things, but I'm happy to consult with people who actually want to do something. The main thing is that you have to be thinking of actually doing something. A thing to notice is just that there has been a large academic literature on the kinds of things that academics can get credit for. So academics can get credit for designing mechanisms or taking data sets and crunching them for estimates, or for doing lab experiments, or even reporting on something that happens at, say, Google or HP or something as just an anthropological description of what happened. But what actually needs to happen in the world are these trials, and academics don't get credit for those trials. So even though academics have published many papers on the kinds of things they can publish papers for, that's still actually not that helpful, because the thing that we need to have happen isn't something academics get credit for, so it's neglected by academics and somebody else has to pick up the slack, or it doesn't happen.
Sorry, there's something that I was missing there. When you were talking about the academics, were you saying that there's a kind of there's publications on something like prediction markets going on in academia?
Yeah, so there are many academic publications on, say, betting markets and various biases potentially in the prices. There are computer science publications, say, on different mechanisms for scoring and reporting and betting and different kind of market makers. There are lab experiments out there in terms of different kind of prediction markets and betting markets compared to other mechanisms in the lab. There is a large literature, with a great many papers on these topics. They're all on the kinds of things that academics can publish. They aren't on the thing we need.
Okay, thanks.
We have a question from George Walker and Jonathan Kale together. It's about the question of anonymous betting in prediction markets versus pseudonymous or named. And Jonathan points out that if people are going to be paid, they certainly can't do this secretly. But more generally, perhaps you can discuss the advantages and disadvantages of each type.
So in ordinary financial markets, the norm is that your trades are private unless the government wants to subpoena your trade. So if the organizations looking into insider trading find some set of trades suspicious, they can break through the privacy and find out more about you. And of course, that is sort of a common norm all through our society. Basically, we have very few barriers against law enforcement when it wants to know something. Basically, we mostly let them see whatever they want to know. But usually we think, well, that's rare and that would be extreme circumstances, and most everybody else can't use that channel, and so you have privacy with respect to most other people. So the main concern with privacy is just that there's somebody who has a message they want everybody to hear, and the market might say otherwise, and they will retaliate against whoever might say otherwise. So for that purpose, the main thing we need is for that person to not be able to figure out who's trading what. That's different from everybody being, not knowing anything. So in general, with respect to privacy, you can just try to create generic privacy where it's impossible for anybody to learn anything, or you can ask which particular privacy violations are of concern, and therefore which things do we try to block. So the simplest thing is to say, well, what are the main reasons why you might want some degree of privacy here? And the main reason is to prevent retaliation. Another reason you might want privacy is to prevent front running, as they call it. If somebody can follow your trades and then jump in front of your trades because they have a faster connection or something, well, then they can take advantage of the profits you would get instead. So you also want to allow people some mechanism to trade where they can keep their trade secret until they execute their trade without letting somebody hear about an upcoming trade that's about to happen and take advantage of them. Those are two reasons why you might want certain kinds of privacy. Neither of those seem to prevent the need, prohibiting law enforcement who has a suspicion and says, we want to look at this particular case from probing it. So I don't necessarily see a need for that strength of privacy, but I don't necessarily oppose it either.
Marcin is asking a couple of questions. One is, do you see applications of prediction markets to topics that interest us, such as effective altruism or existential risk? And also, how do you see the overall accuracy of prediction markets increasing in the next 5 to 20 years, thanks to improved understanding and technological progress?
Let's take that second question first, I guess. The main determinants of accuracy in prediction markets are what question you ask, how many and what people you invite as participants, and what incentives you give them. And then, of course, as long as if there's any assistance they could use, then they could get the assistance. So if people using computer models can get more accurate estimates, or AI machine learning models, then you're not putting that in the central system. You're expecting people to go take advantage of those as they can to make their trades. There are ways to produce technology that allows a lot more markets to be all interconnected. So combinatorial prediction markets are something I worked on for many years. And so instead of just a handful of markets, you can have, in essence, billions of markets all connected together in a way that makes it easy for people to trade through all of them. That's a technology that was around 20 years ago, and it's still around today. And for the most part, basically, there's just an overhang of technology that potentially could be used that isn't being used because none of this is being used. So the main thing that will drive usefully improving technology is for the technology to actually get used. Once people are actually using this sort of things at scale, then of course, all the potential improvements that people have developed and explored over the years would then get explored more seriously and tried seriously and produce more development. But fundamentally, without strong AI, we're still talking about humans looking at questions, thinking about them, collecting whatever information they have, and expressing their opinion when they choose to do so. That's the fundamental process here. And I don't expect that to change greatly.
A quick question. So one concern I've had when talking up Futarchy in the past is that the average government passes tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of policies in a given year. And there's a lot of noise from the environment, which affects how well a country does, from things like the global economic situation, international relations, or just extreme weather events or crises. So given there's a huge amount of noise, and there's a huge amount of policies, presumably each policy having a very small individual effect, wouldn't the noise be sufficient to drown out the effect of any but the most extreme and large decisions, like say going to war? Meaning the prediction market wouldn't function for the vast majority of decisions the government needs to make.
So as you know, we have different aggregation and scales of policy choices in our current government world. We don't have a national referendum on everything. We have national referendums on a small number of things, and then we make choices, say a politician who passes bill, who then approves an agency, who then makes many more decisions. So similarly, yes, you're quite correct to point out that Futarchy would in fact only be able to offer an opinion on a policy that has a big enough effect. It will only speak up on big enough effects. If your effect is small, then it just will say, I don't have an opinion, and it won't be able to support a change. So that means in order to produce more effective change, you'll have to sort of produce regimes that you approve. So for example, let's consider stadiums. Is a stadium cost effective? If we try to have a national Futarchy bill that says, build this stadium, it's gonna say that's too small. But what you could do is pass a bill at the national level saying, this is our new policy for how stadiums will be approved. And once you adopt that new policy, that policy itself may then use Futarchy at a smaller level. That's one of its choices. So for example, for each stadium that's about to be built, you say, well, let's have a betting market in the local revenue and the local job market or something, not in the entire national market. That is, you'd be cutting out some of the noise by focusing on some local variation. That would be a choice to make in the bill that approves that new mechanism. So in general, Futarchy at the national level would then adopt policies which then allow smaller changes. And that would be the general overall thing, which means that you'd have a recursion of Futarchy. Presumably you would often, at the largest level, approve new versions of Futarchy at smaller levels, which then would use more localized outcome metrics in order to approve more local decisions.
Okay, makes sense.
We have another question from Facebook from Daniel Kang about how do prediction markets deal with fat-tailed events? For example, where the median and mean outcomes are wildly different. Predictions of COVID deaths in February, for example. How do we account for this in either welfare measurements or in market structure?
Well, these decision markets have two key things. One is the outcome and the other is the decision. So you can have tails in both cases. You can have a tail in the outcome in either direction. So that means you just want to be careful with the outcome you're considering. So for example, if you consider an outcome that say, thresholds at a certain point, will we have something over a certain amount or under a certain amount, then you'll be insensitive to how much more. So you do want to try to have the outcome measure you're tracking be the thing you care about, and therefore contain the risk you care about. If you care about this thing exponentially, you should be exponential. And if you care about its square root, you should have its square root. You should try to have the outcome measure have the right degree of dependence on the thing you care about in terms of being more linear in your preference about it. And that's the key point, is just to ask for what you want and to make sure the measure of what you want is the measure of what you want. And the more there's a deviation there, the more that you will get misjudging these things. Now, tail events in the decisions would be, typically you're going to have a limited number of decisions, which are the ones being considered. What if there was another decision that you weren't considering? So that has to come back to the agenda mechanism. How can you create incentives for people to put good items on the agenda? So my favorite solution is to have, say, so many slots, they may be once an hour or once a day, so many slots for making a decision. And people bid for each slot. They say, I want my proposal to take today's slot. And they have to pay a certain amount to get that in an auction. That is, there's an auction for each slot, and whoever bids the most gets that slot for their bill. And they pay to put that bill on the agenda. But now they don't get paid it back unless that bill passes. And then if it passes, they get paid the market estimate of the value. That is, when we have a national welfare measure, when something wins, it wins by a difference. That is, the market says it's this much better than the status quo. And that difference is the estimate of how much better it is. So you give the person who proposed it some fraction of that as their reward for proposing it. So that would give people an incentive to go searching for unlikely or neglected proposals to say, hey, you haven't been thinking in terms of this, but I think this could be a big win. Let me pay to put it on the agenda. And of course, at that point, try to offer whatever supporting evidence I have. And if I manage to get it to pass, I win. And we all win.
similar question from Michael Zhang. Is it possible for prediction markets to actually forecast the probability distribution and not just
Oh,
a
of
single
course.
value?
Yes, so it's all just a matter of how finely you want to grade the state space. Basically, so for example, you can have, you know, 1,000 buckets in some spectrum, and then it will give you one number for each of those buckets. Or you can create a line and it will give you the expected value of that line. You can create different moments and it'll give you as many moments as you want. It's just a cost thing. Basically, every new moment you want, every new degree of freedom in the distribution you want, you'll have to pay to create another market. And that's one of the advantages of these combinatorial markets, is they allow you to have, in principle, a vast number of markets, but actually only represent it with a small number of internal states. So basically what we did is used a Bayes net. And as you know, a Bayesian network can use a small number of represented states to allow you to describe a much larger space of combinatorial combinations of all those basic states. And you can do that as well with spectrums.
I have a question about risk aversion, sort of. So if you have a policy that's like correlated with like general well-being or like the stock market or something, and then if the prediction market is like exactly like unbiased, right? Like if it's exactly right and the probabilities are right, then it's like now there's this thing I can buy with an expected value of 0, but like it's like negative risk, right? So like, oh, I should buy that and like add it to my portfolio. So like when you have like things like options that are like correlated with like the stock market or something, is there good ways to like adjust for like systematic like hedging? Yeah, so that's my question.
There might be, but remember this key priority of trying to produce a proposal that people can understand. So I'm worried about trying to add too many extra dials and whistles and things onto it to account for problems and issues that experts may well nod and say, yes, that's a real issue, but that you can't convince ordinary people that your fix is a fix rather than some way you're getting some inside benefit. So that leads me to prefer relatively stark, simple versions, even if they sometimes aren't perfect, but then they are less manipulable, less corruptible. And so that's roughly my attitude on these sort of topics. There's a set of related topics there. If you take these markets literally, then so for example, obviously one issue is we're going to have this national welfare measure and it's going to be denominated in some kind of dollar unit. And what that dollar unit is will matter for the prices. And so in some sense, therefore, in principle, betting, the decision markets denominated in some kind of dollars would give you different recommendations than decision markets, dominated in other kinds of dollars. So the simple thing to do is try to have a very stable dollar that you're representing things in terms of that aren't very sensitive to very many issues, but you're only going to produce that to a limited degree. Nevertheless, I'm wary of going too far in the direction of recommending some complicated fix. Again, in principle, if you are a billionaire and you hire a bunch of experts and you trust them and they give you arguments and you believe them, you could let them do lots of complicated things to give you accurate estimates. But I'm not sure we as a society can do that in deciding who we together trust. We have to have a pretty simple, robust thing that we are all going to agree to defer to and then believe that it's hard to manipulate.
Yeah, that makes sense. My favorite example really quick is just like, if there's like a presidential candidate who like everyone agrees is really bad. And so like everyone's like, oh, well, just in case, I better buy some shares in them. And then it overinflates their probability of like getting elected or whatever. Because like everyone thinks that they're like a good candidate because it's like inflated because people hedging.
Right, but ideally what we're going to do is if an option was surprisingly popular, then we will find out about that before the market closes. So it's a key point. There's a moment when we look at the price and say, now we decide based on this price. And we want that moment to be when everybody sees that price and still lets the price be. We are much more wary of surprises, whereby some outcome was the surprise thing that nobody anticipated. That a lot more things can go wrong there. So what you'd want to do is even have, say, a 1 hour or even 1 day window of the price where we say, we're going to average over which is the best one in this window. So now that if something was initially like low and then it got to be more popular, we could all adjust our trading and adjust our stakes to take that into account. And now then you see after that, you wouldn't necessarily have all those hedges once everybody saw that it was in fact the likely choice.
Hey, Robin.
Yes.
I have a question regarding leveraging prediction markets for accelerating innovation in science. So
Okay.
a lot of proponents, especially now, are fond of using rewards or bounties to encourage innovation. Is there a model to subsidize a prediction market to achieve a similar effect for rewarding innovation? Or more broadly, how do you think about using prediction markets to accelerate science and innovation? Like, there are some people who are.
So that's where I started this topic.
Okay, maybe I'm.
So I, got a degree in philosophy of science, and was thinking about scientific institutions. And then in that context, I started to think about alternative institutions for science and academia. And that's where I initially thought of betting markets as a solution. So I initially focused in great detail on how academia and those sorts of institutions could benefit from the betting markets. I do think there are a lot of things you could do there. The obstacle is more a lack of interest than what you could do. So for abstract scientific things, you could just have betting markets on what the eventual scientific consensus will be. So you could create a market in, say, the mass of the neutrino or things like that. And then eventually people would get the rewards because the price would go to some eventual thing. Now, innovation isn't the same as science per se. For innovation, I would say for a lot of bets on startup companies, your bet is a combination of a bet on some fundamental technology or market and a team. So I would propose that you could use these markets to separate those bets. Instead of having always to bet on the package of a team and a market tech idea, you have bet prediction markets that let you to hedge your risks with respect to the technologies or markets. And then you would make bets on particular teams hedged on those. So people could specialize, some people could specialize in evaluating the team and saying, I believe this team, even if I'm not sure of the technology or market. And other people could specialize in saying, I believe in this tech or market, even if I'm not sure of this team. That would be a way that, by that, allowing that specialization, you could then allow more people to bet in these markets and participate in the innovation markets without taking the risk they take now. Because again, intrinsically today, you're taking this packaged risk on a team and a tech or a market. And we could allow more innovation by allowing separation of that.
Robin, I think your ideas are really important. And I wonder, might they get better adoption if you outsourced your Twitter feed to a professional PR person?
Might is a weak claim, so might is easy to agree to.
Have you considered it?
That would take a budget, of course. Nobody's offered such a budget. Obviously, the simple alternative to that is to never tweet. That also outsources it to a cheap source, but that's somewhat off topic here.
Okay, well, thank you. We've had a lot of questions and it really went very well the last hour and 10 minutes. So I think there's an agreement here that we can finish off this section. Thank you very much, Robin. Everybody is welcome to clap using their buttons at the bottom, but I'm sure they're all clapping even if they're muted. So I'm going to split us into breakout rooms now. In addition, there is for people who like virtual reality, and you don't need a special headset for this, there's Mozilla Hubs. And so in other words, we have multiple rooms. You have a choice of going to Mozilla Hubs or to the breakout rooms. You can leave at any time. You can message me if you have trouble getting into a breakout room. I've never done this before other than some experiments. But the idea here is that I know I love socializing with people from SlateStarCodex meetups, LessWrong meetups. It's very hard to find people who you can have. I know that Robin and his colleagues have these conversations that I read about at lunch. And I just, I wish I could have that sort of thing, which we can have in these meetups. So that's why we're doing breakout rooms. So right now, I'm going to just distribute everybody randomly into, let's say, about 8 rooms, about 10 people each. Roughly about 12 people each in a room. And you can still chat me using the ordinary chat mechanisms in Zoom, and you can email me. And as I mentioned, you can do Mozilla Hub, which I've already sent you a link to. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Robin. And I'll let's have some nice conversations in the breakout room.